Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey, we're so glad you could join us. We have a great topic today. Connor and I are going to be discussing finding truth in a time of mass deception. That really is, I think, an apt description for the time that we live in.
Yeah, I know a few people who would dispute that, but I think it's a little hard to unpack what that means. And then obviously the finding part we'll get to towards the latter half of the episode. What I want to do first with you, Brian, is talk about the deception, because I know you want to talk about, we live in this era where fake news, this term fake news is being popularized, but it's not, it's more than that. And it's more than the buzzword that, Donald Trump uses to dismiss whatever news story he doesn't like, right? There's something substantive underlying that claim. And so let's first maybe unpack what that means so our listeners can be on the same page and perhaps agree with us that we do live in a time of mass deception. The first thing I wanted to start out with, and we'll link to this if you're interested in looking at it on the show notes page for today, which is societyandthestate.com/9, was a Gallup poll that was recently done. And many of these polls are constantly done. In fact, they measure it, I believe, year over year to see where the trends go. And it's a poll to determine what percentage of Americans have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media. And for years, this trend line has been declining. In fact, most recently, it was at 32%. So the overwhelming minority of Americans have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media. Now, that's not born, I guess, of any, Brian, should we believe polls just because they're polls? I guess
No.
I bring up a poll and polls themselves are not necessarily totally truthful, but I think it is indicative of a widespread distrust. I find this interesting though, is, you look at congressional ratings and people have such a low opinion of Congress, and yet it's this abstract Congress that people dislike, but their congressman is different, right? Oh yeah, no, I believe so-and-so, and I called his office, and he told me this, and his newsletter said that. And so people are much more willing to kind of distrust or dislike the abstract, but when it comes to the particular, I think they don't apply that. I think just like with Congress, that applies to the media. People say, I distrust the media, right, because a majority do not have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the news. And yet people still read the news, and then they'll go post it as authoritative on Facebook to their friends. Why do you suppose that is, that there's that disconnect? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think there's a certain cognitive dissonance that comes about from knowing that you have been misled or believing that, hey, this isn't adding up, but nobody wants to be wrong.
Sure.
I don't like to be wrong. You don't like to be wrong. But for a person to admit that they've been given maybe not outright lies, but just half-truths, things that have kept them from accurately seeing the world around them, that's a hard thing to admit. I think there's kind of a self-defense mechanism in our minds that kicks in, that we don't want to believe that. But if that is the case, then let's lay the blame somewhere other than ourselves.
Sure. That's an important point. In fact, I'm hoping that we can get Robert, I don't know how you pronounce his last name, Cialdini. He wrote a phenomenal book called Influence, and it's the psychology of influence. I'm hoping we can have him on a future episode because that book is phenomenal. And in that book, he talks about what you just talked about, how you have the affinity where suddenly when someone posts something or shares it as in, I believe this, or, hey, look at this news, you now have kind of assumed the role of participant in promoting that. And so now you're accountable. And I think it's exactly what you just said, Brian, where you don't want to be wrong, therefore you must be right. And then you start to defend what you just posted. Otherwise you might have been attacking it had someone else posted. It's kind of an odd circumstance. But deception is a step further than dislike of media, right? For now, We've talked about just that distrust or dislike. Deception is a little bit different. And perhaps the most recent story that has made the most news, I'm thinking of Brian Williams, the former anchorman of NBC News. And oddly enough, he's still in the, a news broadcaster. I don't understand how he's employed. But his anchorman career on NBC News, I recall, came to an end. This was just a couple years ago, like 2015, because he had been lying about taking enemy fire while helicoptering into Iraq in 2003. And this was a story that he told over and over again to kind of shape the narrative of who he was and what he did. and it was all complete fabrication. And yet he had consistently said that. Reminds me of, years before that, you had Dan Rather on CBS, I believe, and his career came crumbling down because they had promoted a phony story about George W. Bush's Air National Guard service. And as I recall, they had completely falsified these documents from decades ago that were actually generated using modern word processing software. But what's more is not only did that happen, but then they engaged in this whole cover-up after the fact. And you think if this is really about, independent journalism and, promoting the truth. No, this becomes about corporatism and keeping your sponsors, on board and keeping the financial arrangement intact. It's a business. They're not so much designed to make sure the truth is always being told, because in many cases, the truth doesn't sell. Final story I want to bring up, and Brian, I want to kick over to you to talk more about fake news. I wrote about this one in Feardom, which we'll talk about in a future episode. But this story was always so compelling to me as we talk about deception, because you can see how fabricated this stuff becomes. It's not innocent. It's not unintentional. It is outright fabrication of so-called fake news that is intended to deceive the American public. And you get into this a little bit more when you talk about like false flag events and intentionally trying to mislead the public in order to manufacture, public support. And this was a story in 1990. There was a young Kuwaiti woman, and she testified before Congress. She was only identified by her first name, which was Naira, and she testified before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus about these supposed crimes committed by Iraqi soldiers. She claimed that soldiers had taken babies out of incubators in a hospital and left them to die. And the outrage from this, the congressman and the president repeatedly in the news media began citing this testimony as authoritative and as evidence for the crimes against humanity that were being done, the need, the justification to go into Iraq. And so, Americans were just shocked. They were outraged. There was so much outcry over what was happening. But the claims were all completely false. Later, it was discovered that Naira was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States.
Wow.
And she had been coached by an advertising agency that was paid millions of dollars by Citizens for a Free Kuwait, which is a public relations committee created by officials at the Kuwaiti embassy. And, so one reporter, I have a quote here from the book. He says, "The incubator story seriously distorted the American debate about whether to support military action." But that was the entire point. It's not this inadvertent distortion of a debate. It was intentional deception by this advertising agency coaching this girl and others, spending $1 million provided by the Kuwaiti royal family to determine how best to sway American public opinion. This stuff happens all the time.
And one of the reasons I take this kind of personally is because I spent more than 30 years working in the media. And now, granted, I was working in what I guess some would call the alternative media, being, radio, specifically talk radio. Mm-hmm. But I got pretty good at spotting the clever use of phrasing to make things sound a certain way. And this is happening even today. There was an attack on an individual, a mentally challenged individual. I believe this was earlier this year, in which a news station, I believe it was in Texas, reported on it and said that an individual was attacked by several attackers, this mentally challenged individual, and the attackers were invoking Donald Trump's name. And it led you to believe that, oh my goodness, man, a bunch of Donald Trump supporters went out there and beat the crud out of this poor, special needs guy. Well, as it turns out, no, it was a bunch of thugs, and I mean like gang members who beat up this guy because he was wearing a "Make America Great Again" hat. So yeah, they were shouting about Donald Trump, but they were shouting epithets and they were anyways. But it just totally turned it on its head.
Right.
And it was strictly through the phrasing that they used. And look, I'm not trying to insult anybody when I say this, but the vast majority of Americans who get their news through mass media tend to be pretty passive about how they absorb that information. So to the casual listener or the casual viewer, that's going to come off as, oh, sounds like more of those Trump supporters are out there causing violence, when it was actually exactly the opposite. And it was a Trump supporter or just somebody wearing a piece of Trump paraphernalia who got attacked for it.
You said phrasing, and I think a twist on that is also framing. So I think of the examples where you see how the visual effect of a photojournalism story, whether we're talking about photo for newspapers or online or video, where they will intentionally frame the shot in a way that is designed to perpetuate the narrative. So, for example, we all know that the media is mostly quote unquote left leaning, even though I don't really like the left and the right because I think it's all statist. But listeners understand what I mean by that. And what you find very often is when there are protests by conservatives, for example, Tea Party type people, the media will do wide shots because often these meetings have very few people, right? And so that's the psychological effect of social proof, where they're saying, "Oh, look, only 12 people showed up to this
Nobody's
thing.
there.
Nobody cares, right? These people are in the minority." And so they'll do wide shots to show the small amount, right? The small impact. And then you see the flip side, where you'll see, when you had, what was the one where they were camping, the Wall Street protest a few years ago?
Occupy Wall Street.
Occupy Wall Street. You'd see some examples where there would be, 15, 20 people out front, but then they'd get tight shots, right? Or someone would be standing up with the bullhorn behind this large group of people. And there's actually a few images floating online. I'll have to see if I can post this on our Facebook page if I find one. Someone got a shot of one of these where they did here's what the news showed, and it was the tight shot, guy at the bullhorn, a lot of people behind him, and then someone like a bystander, someone on social media snapped the wide shot of the same scenario, and you could see there were like 20 or 30 people there, but everyone watching the news saw the tight shot and thought that, oh my gosh, there's this huge sea of people because look how packed that frame is. And that's another example of deception, not only the phrasing, but the framing as well.
And something you want to keep in mind, too, when it comes to mass media, and I'm going to paint with a little bit of a broad brush here, but this is an industry that wants to bring in money. It's important that they bring in commerce. Well, guess what sells?
Controversy
And fear.
Absolutely.
Oh, man, fear. I'm going to give you a quote here from Paul Rosenberg, one of my favorite thinkers, who describes how news channels, this is how they operate. He says, frightening stories are the engine of their profits. They scour the earth for terrifying images and fearful possibilities, and then they deliver them to huge swaths of humanity who have an innate weakness for such things. It's like selling sugar donuts to the obese.
Makes me think what the media would have latched onto had 9/11 not happened. You look at the overwhelming fear that modern day so-called terrorism has generated, and it just leaves me to ponder, what would people be fearing today if it weren't for these latest boogeymen that have been in some cases concocted?
That's a good question. And I'm going to reiterate again. It's not the outright lies that a person needs to be aware of. It's the half-truths or the omissions of a full picture that really lead us astray.
I'm so glad you just said that, because I had here in my notes to talk about omission as well, that it's so easy to talk about deception, intentional manipulation, and the half-truths designed to deceive. But I wanted to share from my experience the biggest problem in media, and you just touched on it, that is omission. So for example, in our policy work at Libertas, we often are behind the scenes in doing things that end up in the news, right? We are in meetings, we are proposing things, we're doing things, and the media is covering those things. Or, the media is sitting in a meeting at the Capitol that I'm at, and I know intimately what's happening, who's been saying what. I was there for the whole meeting. I know the behind the scenes, the backstory. And then I read the report. I read the news article later online. And I say this not with much criticism, but just with a word of caution because of the human element of all of this. What I mean by that is reporters are tasked with reporting on all sorts of things they usually know little about. And so they have to ask people for help. They go to me or someone else authoritative and say, hey, what about this? And can you fill me in here? And is this correct? And so they're asking for help. They're on a deadline because they're having to write about constant things, and they have limited space. And so with all of these limitations, you end up with a lot of omission. It is very common for me to see reports of something that I'm involved in that I feel gets maybe 5% of the truth, because the truth requires the whole truth. It requires context. It requires understanding the different elements of that. And you can't get that in a 30-second TV segment. You can't get that in a 600-word article online. And so those are inherent limitations in media. The problem is if the public does not understand those limitations and thereby interpret the quote unquote news in that way to think, oh, no, this is only revealing 5% or 20% or whatever, people assume it's 100%. I think that gap, that assumption is where a lot of the problem lies.
I appreciate that you clarify that too, because I don't want to make this sound like, this is a crusade here that we're having against the news media. Just understand you have to approach it with caution. And I guess most importantly, understand the news that you get, if you're relying on mass media for your news, that information has been pretty thoroughly worked over by the time it reaches you. If you really want to understand a particular issue or a particular story, the responsibility is on you to do the work of analyzing and researching and vetting information for yourself.
It reminds me of an earlier episode where we talked about why free people still read books. And I shared one of the books that I recommend, which is Propaganda by Edward Bernays. I want to read a small portion because it pertains precisely to what we're talking about here. This is starts on page 9 in the book. And for those who didn't listen to episode 3, we'll link to it on today's show notes page, societyandthestate.com/9 or /3 to get straight there. And Edward Bernays was a close confidant of Woodrow Wilson during the Progressive era. He was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. He was basically the first guy to figure out how to use psychological manipulation to achieve persuasive outcomes. So this is what he says in the book. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate the organized habits and opinions of the masses constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of the country. It remains a fact that in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. I mean, wow. And this was written over a century ago, and he talks about harnessing old social forces, because none of this is new. This deception ain't new, right? Old social forces and contriving new ways to bind and guide the world. And so we live in an era much different than a century ago. There are plenty of new ways to do it, right? You got TV and Twitter and everything else, but this is part of a long-standing trend that has been happening.
I would have the opinion, too, that because of all those additional sources of information, the need to be extremely careful is magnified. Think back, and maybe some of you will be young enough to remember this. It used to be the news came on once a day. Mm-hmm. You had 3 channels to choose from, and
Walter Cronkite.
So once a day the news came on, and they would give you a snapshot of here's what's going on in the world. But now it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous, and it's 24/7.
Yeah.
And as you were mentioning before, people have to make decisions. What do we have time to cover?
Right.
And you'll notice if you pay attention to how newscasts are structured, there's always the lead story is portrayed. This is the most important story in the world today. And the only reason I say that and kind of have to go, really, is because sometimes the lead story is Donald Trump tweeted this rude message. It's like, that is the most important story in the world today.
But to your earlier point, it's controversy. That's what sells.
And it creates anger. And for some people, it creates fear. And they'll progress through, the hierarchy of these are the most important stories. A story is super important if the news anchor is actually there on location. They are like the high priest or priestess of a type of religion. And they're there to tell us this is what it all means. This is the meaning of everything. And they're making sense of it for us. And as the newscast goes on, they'll finally get down to where they're giving you some fluffy stories, which with the internet, if you watch closely, they're basically just recycling whatever video happens to be going viral for that day.
But you bring up such a good point where we talk about what Bernays just said and the new ways to do this. We live in the information age where we are being inundated. So the title of our episode today is not just we live in a time of mass deception that sucks. Too bad, so sad. But finding truth. How do we do that? Brian, how do we find truth in a time of mass deception?
I think the first thing you have to do is realize that you will not get the full picture. if you're simply going to a mass media source. And I mean any mass media source. So what you have to be willing to do is find the books and the serious publications that you can go to and research independently. But you need to maintain a healthy sense of skepticism about anything that you're taking in.
Absolutely. I'm glad you pointed that out. That was in my notes as well, that you have to almost cultivate an inherent sense of disbelief in everything you're reading. And that's tough. Even after I wrote the book Feardom, and I talk a lot about this in that book, I'd still find myself reading news stories and not having that filter in place and just thinking that what I read was precisely what happened. And then I'd see 3 months later that wasn't quite right. And then I'd say, oh my gosh, I fell, gullible, I'm susceptible to the same thing. So even those of us who are very concerned about this and very aware of it, it's tough to do, but you have to develop almost just this innate distrust in everything you're reading. And that's tough. I think we're inherently a believing people, or especially our culture. We're willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. We're willing to assume good faith. So you almost have to assume the opposite. You have to assume bad motives from news media, and that's tough.
Something I noticed in my years on the radio was I had a lot of conversations with people, and sometimes I would hear from angry people. I know, unheard of in talk radio, but depending on what made a person angry, I could tell where they got their news. It's that predictable. If this is what was setting them off, chances are these are the sources that they were going to for their news. And it just comes down to this: you have to understand that there's always some kind of an agenda, or there's some kind of a contest for your allegiance. And it doesn't matter the source. Right now, we are contesting for your allegiance, not to us necessarily, but to the idea that maybe it's time to think outside the box.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another thing I think of touches on what you said earlier, and that is people, most people passively consume media. Right? They'll hear something, they'll listen to something, they'll assume it's true, and off they go spouting it as if they're an expert on that topic because they heard someone talk about it. So it's very passive. So I think if we're finding truth, in my experience, it requires a much more active role rather than a passive role. You can't passively click on news articles posted on Facebook or Twitter or wherever and assume that those things are accurate. If you are wanting to learn about something, you have to actively investigate, and that requires redundancy. So first of all, you have to search multiple sources. I've found a lot of success, frankly, in reading international media, especially English and European media, especially when it comes to foreign policy type issues, because you'll find a much different perspective, and you'll find them interviewing different people and coming to different conclusions than domestic American media does. And so having multiple sources of input that you actively seek to include in your investigation is going to help. I think the skepticism plays an active part. And I think almost at the end of the day, you have to assume that even after an active investigation, even after researching something, that it's likely you still don't have the full picture and you still don't know.
I think one of the keys to really becoming a well-informed person is having the courage to say the words, I don't know, and admit that even with everything that you do know, there's probably a lot you don't. Charlie Reese was a newspaper columnist for about 50 years, wrote for the Orlando Sentinel, and he had this test that I have found very useful. He said, take any person or any issue and ask yourself, what do I really know about this that wasn't told to me by someone else? He says, more often than not, the answer is going to be very little. And that's not to say, so therefore you should hang your head in shame and just walk around in this state of indecision everywhere because I can't really know anything. It's just admitting that what we think we know is sometimes much more limited than we're willing to admit, whether that's a product of ego or whatever.
Yeah.
If we can admit, okay, I don't really know that much about this, that should be some incentive, if it matters to you, to go out there and do the hard work of digging and finding out what you need to.
And that's tough because I think especially in the social media world, we all like to brand ourselves as experts. Some of the funniest memes I've seen are when the Supreme Court is about to come out with some ruling and someone will post like that Game of Thrones meme, the guy with the sword, and says, brace yourselves, the constitutional experts are coming, because all of a sudden everyone is like an authoritative source. But you're right, like it requires humility to say, well, actually, I don't know. And what I like about that is it positions yourself in the role of student versus teacher. We all like to be teachers. We all want to think that we know something. But in reality, we're all students. We're all still learning. And I like that approach. Another thing that I think of when we're talking about finding truth is, something that Christ taught. By their fruits you shall know them. Very standard principle, whether you're Christian or religious or not, having evidence. And part of the problem in our society is deference and trust for people in a costume, right? So, for example, police officers. Just because someone has the costume and the badge, many people in our society give deference to and trust those people, when for all we know, it could be a child predator. It could be someone with a very sadistic personality, very aggressive behaviors. That person might kill us tomorrow. Just because someone is a police officer does not mean they're trustful and kind and pursuing justice. And yet we interpret people based on their outward appearance, right? So police officers, we just assume, they're all great. I think the same thing goes for media. If Dan Rather, right, or if Brian Williams, if the only reason that people trust them is because they're a recognizable face, what are their fruits? What's their evidence? All they do is read a teleprompter. They read things that other people write for them. We have to have fruit beyond the outward appearance, beyond the likability, beyond the recognizability of that guy on Channel 7, every night at 9. And so I think of people who have the right fruits. And where we're talking about finding truth, I think one of the best fruits you can look for is people who are critical of power. Because in our, there's a term that doesn't come to mind, but in our media wants access. So think of just with the president, for example. The media want access. They want to be able to get interviews. They want scoops. They want
that status that goes with it.
Precisely. They want to be able to sit in the room, and so they are cautious to do things that will jeopardize that status and that access. And that comes at the expense of hard-hitting investigative journalism that would actually seek to reveal the truth. People don't want to take it. Reporters, tend not to want to take it too far because that could then burn a bridge to which they want access later on. And then I think of people like Glenn Greenwald, right? This is a guy who started out in the journalism space as a blogger and then as an author. And now he runs his own, it's called The Intercept. He runs his own independent investigative journalism organization. And this is a guy who has challenged power on the left and on the right and has consistently demonstrated fruits that he is willing to challenge and upend the narrative that the mainstream media, the complicit mainstream media, and the institutions of power are putting out there. And so that is someone that I come to trust, not because he's a pretty face, not because he's been on the TV for 30 years, but because he's actually demonstrated an ability to challenge the narrative and go after what the real story is.
What you're describing is a person who loves truth more than their attachment to their personal beliefs or their personal ideology. And I think that's a good measure that you've described there.
And I think we have to be careful with that because Glenn Greenwald, as an example, we'll just use him since I named him, he's human. He's subject to the same, I don't know if temptations is the right word, or limitations and, shortcutting and wanting to, he's going to have benefactors and sponsors and all of those same elements can come in. And so you have to be careful that even when it's people who have fruits, who have evidence, you still have to have that distrust. It may very well be that what Glenn Greenwald or whoever is reporting still may not be the total truth, but better to lean towards pursuing knowledge through those sources that have demonstrated they're willing to go after truth at all costs, rather than the quote unquote lapdog media that just puts out or relays press releases and regurgitates the official narrative.
The stenographer's pool. Okay, one final thought here. If you find yourself getting anxious over what you see or what you find coming through your news feed, if the news information that you're getting is making you anxious, angry, or fearful, take a fast. Take 3-4 days, maybe take a week, and just step away from the media entirely, including social media. Mm-hmm. And I ask you to do this just to see if this happens. See if the world starts looking a little more normal after just a couple of days. That's been my experience, and most of the people I've talked to who've tried this have said, yeah, suddenly when I'm not getting my daily dread supplement, the world does seem a lot more normal, which frees you up to work on the world that you want to create and the world that you would like to contribute to, instead of worrying over things that either may or may not be entirely true or that you have no control over.
And that's a great idea. And many people who fast for a prolonged period will still drink water to sustain themselves. So on your media fast, everybody, we will be your water. You can continue to listen to Society and the State. Be sure and subscribe. We have some great episodes coming up. In fact, the next interview we have, I'm super excited for. This is a guy, John Perkins, who had a former life as an economic hitman. This is going to be fascinating. So stick around. Make sure you share it with friends. We'll be your water. Be careful on that fast. Quench your thirst with Society and the State. Subscribe today, and we'll see you soon.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.